Hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable position, perhaps adjusting your pillow just slightly, letting your shoulders relax away from your ears. Tonight, we're going to take a long, slow journey through one of humanity's oldest and most comforting companions, bread. This isn't a story of grand events or dramatic moments. Instead, it's the quiet tale of flour and water, of patient hands and slow fermentation, of warm ovens and the simple satisfaction of breaking bread. There's no urgency here, only the gentle unfolding of centuries, the slow turning of millstones, and the timeless rhythm of kneading dough. As we move through this history together, you might feel your breathing naturally slow, your thoughts becoming softer, more diffuse. That's perfectly fine. You're welcome to drift in and out of awareness as we explore. The story will continue, patient and unhurried, whether you're listening closely or floating at the edges of sleep. We'll begin our journey more than 10,000 years ago, though time moves differently in our story. Days blend into seasons, seasons into years, years into millennia. And through it all, there is bread, rising and baking, cooling and breaking, nourishing people whose names we'll never know. So settle in. There's no rush. We have all the time we need. Let's begin at the very beginning, with wild grasses waving in an ancient wind, 10,000 years before our time, in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent. Wild grasses grew in abundance. These weren't the cultivated grains we know today. They were their wild ancestors, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, growing naturally across hillsides and valleys. Picture, if you will, these ancient grasslands. The sun rises slowly over rolling hills. The grasses sway in the morning breeze, a subtle, rhythmic motion. Each plant holds its seeds loosely, ready to scatter at the slightest touch. This is how they spread, year after year, in their own time. Early humans noticed these grasses. They noticed how the seeds could be gathered, collected in woven baskets. They noticed how these seeds could be stored, tucked away in cool, dry places. And they noticed, most importantly, how these seeds could sustain them through the lean times. At first, the seeds were likely eaten raw, or perhaps soaked in water until they softened. The taste would have been nutty, earthy. Chewing them required patience. The hulls were tough, the kernels dense. But they provided nourishment. They provided sustenance. Then someone discovered something transformative, though we'll never know their name or their thoughts at the moment of discovery. Perhaps it was accidental. Seeds falling near a fire, getting hot, becoming easier to chew. Or perhaps it was intentional experimentation, the kind that happens when people have time, and curiosity, and need. The seeds, when heated, became different. The heat made them more digestible. The flavors changed, became richer, more complex. And so began humanity's long relationship with processed grain. Though the word processed seems too modern, too industrial for what was simply people applying heat to seeds. Grinding came next, though perhaps not immediately. It might have taken centuries. Time moved slowly then, generations living much as the generation before. The earliest grinding was simple. 2 stones, one flat, one rounded to fit in the palm. The rounded stone, called a hand stone or saddle stone, pressed and rubbed against the flat stone beneath. Between them, the grain. The motion was rhythmic, back and forth, back and forth. The sound was a soft, sandy whisper. The work was slow. It took time to grind enough flour for a single day's needs. Time measured not in minutes, but in the arc of the sun across the sky. This work often fell to women, though not exclusively. Archaeological evidence shows worn knee bones, compressed vertebrae, the physical marks of hours spent kneeling, grinding. But there is a rhythm to repetitive work, a kind of meditation. The mind can wander. Stories can be told. Songs can be sung. The flour that resulted from this grinding wasn't fine like modern flour. It was coarse, full of small fragments of grain. Bits of stone dust mixed in from the grinding stones themselves, which wore down slowly over years of use. This added minerals to the diet, though it also wore down teeth, a price paid for sustenance. What could be done with this flour? Many things, it turned out. It could be mixed with water to make a thin gruel. It could be scattered on hot stones to make a quick, unleavened flatbread. It could be formed into thick porridge, bubbling slowly over a fire. Each of these preparations had its place. Each satisfied hunger in its own way, and each required patience, the patience to gather, to grind, to cook, to wait. Now we arrive at one of the quiet miracles of human history. The discovery that flour and water, left alone together, change. Imagine this moment of discovery, though again, we can only imagine someone mixed flour and water, perhaps more than they needed immediately. The mixture sat forgotten or deliberately set aside. Hours passed, the mixture began to bubble slightly. It developed a slightly sour, yeasty smell. Was it spoiled? Perhaps they thought so at first, but someone, driven by curiosity or hunger or simply a reluctance to waste, cooked this bubbling mixture anyway, and they discovered something wonderful. The bread that resulted was different, lighter, airier. The flavor was more complex, tangy and rich. It was easier to chew. It stayed fresh longer. What had happened, though they couldn't know it, was that wild yeasts and bacteria from the air and the grain itself had colonized the mixture. These microorganisms fed on the starches in the flour, producing carbon dioxide gas and various acids. The gas created tiny bubbles throughout the dough. The acids developed flavor and helped preserve the bread. This process, this transformation through fermentation, would become central to bread making, but in those early days it was mysterious. The dough seemed almost alive. It grew, expanded, breathed, and indeed, in a way, it was alive, teeming with invisible life, working patiently to transform simple ingredients.
Let us drift now down the timeline and across the landscape to ancient Egypt, a civilization shaped by a river and nourished by bread. The Nile River, flowing north through the desert, flooded predictably each year. The floods brought rich, dark silt from far upstream, spreading it across the floodplains. When the waters receded, this silt remained. Fertile and ready for planting, Egyptian farmers planted emmer, wheat, and barley in this replenished soil. The planting was done by hand, seeds scattered in a practiced motion, arms sweeping across the field. Sometimes herds of sheep or goats were driven across the planted fields, their hooves pressing the seeds into the soft mud. Then came the waiting. The crops grew under the Egyptian sun, watered by residual moisture from the flood. Slowly, green shoots emerged. Slowly, they grew taller. Slowly, the grain heads formed and ripened, turning from green to gold. Harvest time arrived in late spring. The grain was cut with wooden sickles set with flint blades. The work was hot, dusty, performed under an intense sun. But there was a rhythm to it, a community effort. People worked together, moving across the fields, gathering the stalks. The grain was threshed, beaten to separate the seeds from the stalks. It was winnowed, tossed in the air so the lighter chaff blew away, while the heavier grain fell back down. Each step was necessary. Each step took time. The grain that resulted fed an entire civilization, and much of it became bread. In ancient Egypt, bread was more than food. It was currency. Workers were paid in bread and beer. Tomb paintings show loaves being counted and recorded. The Egyptian word for bread, ta, was used in hieroglyphics as a symbol for food itself. Egyptian bread came in many forms. Archaeologists have identified over 40 different shapes and types, from artistic depictions and actual preserved loaves found in tombs. Some loaves were round and flat, others were conical, some were shaped like animals or other forms for religious purposes. The baking process in ancient Egypt was elaborate and fascinating in its simplicity. Let's walk through it slowly, imagining ourselves in an Egyptian household or bakery 3,000 years ago. First, the grain must be ground. In larger bakeries, this was done in quantities, with multiple workers grinding at once. The stones scraped rhythmically. The flour accumulated slowly, a small pile becoming larger as the morning progressed. The flour was then sifted, though not finely by our standards. Different grades of flour were produced. Finer flour for the wealthy, coarser flour for common people. The process of sifting was meditative, shaking the sieve back and forth, watching the fine flour drift through while the coarser bits remained behind. Water was added to the flour, along with salt. The mixing was done by hand or by foot, people literally treading the dough in large containers. This required physical effort but also created a connection with the dough, a tactile understanding of when the consistency was right. Here's where Egyptian bread making becomes particularly interesting. To leaven the dough, Egyptians used several methods. Sometimes they used leftover dough from a previous batch, which contained active yeast. Sometimes they used the foam from beer brewing, which was also rich in yeast. And sometimes, for quickly made flatbreads, they used no leavening at all. The dough was left to ferment. In the warm Egyptian climate, this happened relatively quickly, though still requiring patience. The dough softened, expanded, developed its characteristic tangy aroma. Bakers learned to read the dough, to know by look and feel when it was ready. Shaping the loaves was an art. Hands formed the dough into various shapes, smooth and practiced in their movements. Each baker had their style, their preferred forms. The shaped loaves were set aside to rise once more. A final fermentation before baking. Egyptian ovens were remarkable in their design. Many were cone-shaped structures made of Nile clay. The fire was built inside the oven, usually with dried reeds or wood. As the fire burned, the clay absorbed heat, becoming almost glowing hot. When the temperature was right, and this was judged by experience, by the color of the clay, by the intensity of the heat radiating outward, the fire was allowed to burn down to coals. Sometimes these coals were removed. Sometimes they were spread out, and the bread placed directly on them. The bread could be placed inside the oven, against the hot clay walls. It could be placed in the coals themselves. For some breads, especially flatbreads, the dough was literally stuck to the hot exterior of the oven, where it baked quickly in the direct heat. Alternatively, bread could be baked in cylindrical clay molds called bedja. The dough was placed inside these preheated molds, which were then covered and placed in the coals. The bread cooked from all sides at once, steaming inside the clay vessel. The smell of baking bread filled the air. It's a smell that hasn't changed in thousands of years. Yeasty, warm, slightly sweet. It's a smell that signals home, comfort, nourishment. The baking took time, not hours necessarily, but significant time nonetheless. Time in which other tasks were done, other preparations made. Ancient life wasn't measured in minutes. A task took as long as it took. When the bread was ready, and again, this was judged by experience, by sight and smell, it was removed from the oven. It cooled. The crust crackled softly as the interior steam escaped, and then it was ready, ready to be eaten fresh, or stored, or paid as wages, or offered to the gods. The Egyptians recognized that bread sustained more than just the body. It sustained the social order. It sustained the economy. And in their religious worldview, it sustained the gods and the dead in the afterlife. Tombs were stocked with loaves of bread, baked specially for the deceased's journey beyond. Let us pause here for a moment. Feel the warmth of that ancient Egyptian sun. Smell the bread baking. Hear the distant sound of the Nile flowing endlessly north. Time moves slowly here. There's no need to rush. When you're ready, we'll continue our journey. As we drift forward in time, we come to Rome. The Roman Empire, at its height, stretched from Britain to Syria, from Spain to Egypt, and one of the great challenges of maintaining this empire was feeding its population, particularly the city of Rome itself. Rome consumed enormous quantities of grain. At its peak, the city housed perhaps 1 million people, though estimates vary. These people needed to eat. They needed bread. The grain came from across the empire. Egypt, which Rome controlled after the death of Cleopatra, was the breadbasket of the empire. North Africa supplied grain. Sicily supplied grain. Each harvest season, these grains were collected, loaded onto ships, and transported to Rome. Imagine these grain ships for a moment. Large merchant vessels, their hulls filled with sacks of grain. They sailed the Mediterranean, moving with the wind and the seasons. The journey from Egypt to Rome could take weeks, depending on weather and wind. The captains watched the sky. The sailors worked the ropes. And in the hold, the grain waited, patient and timeless. In Rome, the grain was unloaded at the port of Ostia. It was stored in massive warehouses called Horia. These structures were engineering marvels, built with ventilation in mind, designed to keep the grain dry and cool. The grain sat in these warehouses, waiting to be distributed. The distribution of grain was a political matter. Roman citizens received a grain dole, a guaranteed ration. This kept the population stable, kept them from rioting. Bread and circuses, as the saying went, keep the people fed and entertained. and the empire runs smoothly. But the grain itself still needed to become bread. And this is where Roman bakeries enter our story. Let's step into a Roman bakery, a pistrina, and spend a day there, not a rushed day, but a day measured in the rhythms of work. The day begins early, well before dawn. The baker or their assistants arrive in the darkness. The first task is to revive the fire in the oven. Roman ovens were similar in principle to Egyptian ovens, but often larger and more sophisticated. Some were massive brick structures that could bake dozens of loaves at once. The fire is fed with wood or charcoal. It's built up slowly, coaxing heat from ember to flame. The baker knows this fire, knows how it behaves, knows how much fuel it needs. This knowledge comes from experience, from years of repetition. While the oven heats, the dough must be prepared. In larger bakeries, the mixing was sometimes done by animals, donkeys or horses walking in circles, turning large mixing mechanisms. In smaller bakeries, it was done by hand, the baker's arms working the dough. The ingredients were simple: flour, water, salt, and leaven, usually a piece of dough saved from the previous day's baking. These were mixed together, the water absorbed by the flour, the leaven distributed throughout. The mixing had to be thorough but not rushed. The dough needed time to come together, time for the proteins in the flour to form gluten, giving the dough its characteristic elasticity. The baker learned to feel this transformation in their hands. Once mixed, the dough was left to ferment. In the warm Mediterranean climate, this didn't take long, perhaps a few hours. But during those hours, the baker attended to other tasks, perhaps cleaning the work surfaces, perhaps checking the oven temperature, perhaps, if it was quiet, simply resting. When the dough had risen sufficiently, it was divided and shaped. Roman bread came in various forms. The most common was a round loaf, often scored on top in a cross pattern that divided it into 8 wedges. This pattern, incidentally, is still used today in many traditional breads. The shaping was quick but careful. The dough was formed into rounds, placed on a wooden peel dusted with flour. The scored pattern was cut into the top with a sharp blade. Then came another weight, a final rise before baking, when the oven was hot enough, and this was judged by experience, perhaps by tossing a handful of flour into the oven and watching how quickly it browned. The loaves were loaded. The peel slid into the oven. The loaves transferred onto the oven floor. One after another, the loaves went in, until the oven was full. The door was closed. The wait began. Inside the oven, remarkable transformations were occurring. The heat killed the yeast, but not before one final burst of activity produced more gas. The dough expanded. The gluten structure set. The sugars in the crust began to caramelize, developing flavor and color. Water evaporated, creating steam that helped form the crust. All of this happened invisibly, behind the closed oven door. The baker waited, judging time by long experience. Too soon, and the bread would be doughy inside. Too late, and it would be overly dark, dried out. At the right moment, and the baker always knew this moment, the door opened. The loaves were removed, one by one, using the long peel. They were set aside to cool, steam rising from their crusts. The smell of fresh bread drifted out into the street. Neighbors knew this smell. They knew the rhythm of the bakery, and soon, customers would arrive. In Rome, as in Egypt, bread was more than just personal sustenance. It was a social commodity. People purchased bread from commercial bakeries because many homes didn't have ovens. The bakery was a community gathering place. News was exchanged. Gossip was shared. Children were sent with coins to purchase the family's daily bread. The baker knew their customers. They knew who liked their bread well done, who preferred it lighter. They knew who would come early, who would arrive late. This knowledge was part of the craft, just as much as knowing when the dough was ready or when the oven was hot enough. As the day progressed, batches of bread came and went. The oven never fully cooled. As soon as one batch was removed, another was prepared. This continued through the day, into the evening, until the last batch was done. Then came the cleaning. The work surfaces were scraped down. The tools were organized. A piece of dough was set aside. Tomorrow's leaven. The fire in the oven was allowed to die down, though some heat was retained for the next day's baking. The bakery fell quiet. The day's work was done. And somewhere in the city, families were breaking bread together, bread that had traveled from distant fields, been ground to flour, mixed and fermented, shaped and baked. Simple bread, but carrying with it the labor of many hands and the weight of history. Let's rest here for a moment. The Roman day is done. The night is quiet. The bread has been made, as it was made yesterday, as it will be made tomorrow. An endless cycle, patient and predictable. When you're ready, we'll move on to the next chapter of our story. Time shifts forward now, and we find ourselves in medieval Europe. The landscape has changed. The Roman Empire has fragmented. New societies have formed. But the need for bread remains constant. One of the most significant developments in medieval bread making was the refinement of milling technology. While hand grinding continued in many places, particularly in homes, larger mills became increasingly common. Watermills appeared wherever there was flowing water. Picture a medieval watermill beside a stream. The water flows steadily, year-round, patient, and inexorable. A wheel sits partially in the stream, catching the current. The water pushes against the paddles of the wheel. Slowly, steadily, the wheel turns. This turning motion is transferred through gears and shafts to the millstones above. One stone sits stationary. Above it, another stone rotates. The grain is fed into a hole in the center of the upper stone. Gravity pulls it down between the stones. As the upper stone rotates, the grain is ground finer and finer, until it emerges as flour from the edges. The sound of the mill is distinctive. The splash and gurgle of water, the rumble and scrape of stone on stone, the constant, rhythmic creaking of the wooden mechanisms. It's a sound that becomes part of the landscape, a reassuring reminder that flour is being produced, that bread can be made. Operating a mill required constant attention. The flow of water needed to be managed. The stones needed to be maintained, periodically recarved to maintain their grinding surfaces. The flour needed to be collected, sifted, stored. But compared to hand grinding, the mill was remarkably efficient. One mill could produce flour for an entire community. In many areas, mills were owned by the local lord. Peasants were required to use the lord's mill, paying a portion of their grain as a fee. This wasn't always popular, but it was the system. The miller, occupying this essential role, became an important figure in medieval society. Windmills appeared in areas without sufficient water flow. These worked on similar principles, but catching the wind instead of water. The great sails turned slowly in the breeze. Their motion transferred to the grinding stones. Windmills required even more skill to operate, as the wind was less predictable than flowing water. Both water and windmills share something essential. They work with natural forces, patiently harnessing power that's freely available. They don't rush. They simply turn, hour after hour, day after day, grinding grain into flour at nature's pace. In medieval towns, bakers formed guilds. These were professional organizations that regulated the trade, maintained standards, and protected the interests of their members. To become a baker required years of training. A boy, usually around age 12 or 14, would be apprenticed to a master baker. The apprenticeship lasted 7 years, sometimes longer. During this time, the apprentice learned every aspect of the craft. The learning was not formal in the way we might understand it. There were no textbooks, no written instructions. Instead, the apprentice learned by watching, by doing, by endless repetition. He learned to judge the quality of flour by sight and feel. He learned to mix dough until the texture was exactly right. He learned to read the behavior of yeast, understanding how temperature and time affected fermentation. He learned the art of shaping, how to form a round loaf that would bake evenly, how to create decorative breads for special occasions. He learned to manage the oven, to judge temperature, to time the baking perfectly. All of this took time. Years of waking before dawn, years of kneading dough until his arms ached, years of tending the oven in all weather. But slowly, steadily, the skills became second nature. The movements became automatic. The judgments became intuitive. After completing the apprenticeship, the young man became a journeyman. He could work for wages but couldn't yet open his own shop. To become a master baker required producing a masterpiece, a demonstration of skill judged by the guild. Only then could he open his own bakery, take on his own apprentices, and join the guild as a full member. The guild regulated many aspects of baking. They set standards for bread quality. They determined prices. They established where bakeries could be located. They punished bakers who cheated customers by using inferior ingredients or selling underweight loaves. This regulation might seem restrictive, but it served important purposes. It ensured that bread, so central to life, was reliable and safe. It prevented a race to the bottom where quality would be sacrificed for profit. It maintained the dignity of the craft. Medieval bread came in remarkable variety, reflecting the rigid social hierarchy of the time. At the top was manchet bread, sometimes called white bread or lord's bread. This was made from the finest flour, carefully sifted multiple times to remove all but the whitest endosperm of the wheat kernel. Manchet was light, soft, and expensive. Only the wealthy ate it regularly. The flour for manchet bread was ground as fine as possible. It was mixed with water, salt, and yeast, then shaped into small, round loaves. These were baked until golden, their crumbs soft and tender. To eat manchet was a mark of status, a visible demonstration of wealth. Below manchet came various grades of wheat bread, each progressively coarser. These used flour that hadn't been sifted as thoroughly, retaining more of the wheat kernel. The bread was denser, darker, but still nutritious and satisfying. Then came maslin bread, made from a mixture of wheat and rye. This was common bread for common people. The combination of grains created a bread that was affordable, but substantial. Maslin had a distinctive flavor, earthy and slightly sour, especially if the rye content was high. At the bottom of the hierarchy was horse bread, made from beans, peas, and the coarsest grain. This was fed to horses and, in times of famine, eaten by the poorest members of society. It was heavy, dense, sometimes bitter, but it sustained life. Beyond these basic types, there were specialty breads for various purposes. Trencher bread was baked specifically to serve as plates. These were large, flat, stale slices of bread that could hold meat and gravy. After the meal, the trencher, soaked with juices, would be eaten or given to the poor. Altar breads, used in religious services, were unleavened and made with great care and purity. Special feast day breads, shaped into symbolic forms, marked religious holidays. Wedding breads, christening breads, funeral breads, each had its place in the cycle of medieval life. The baking of these various breads followed the same basic principles we've been exploring: mixing, fermenting, shaping, baking. But each type required specific knowledge, specific techniques. The baker needed to understand how different flours behaved, how much water they absorbed, how long they needed to ferment. Consider a medieval bakery on a typical day. The master baker has been up since before dawn. The oven has been fired and is reaching the right temperature. Several batches of dough are at different stages, some just mixed, some rising, some ready to shape. The baker moves between tasks with practiced efficiency, but without rush. There's a rhythm to the work, a flow. Dough is shaped and set aside to rise. Risen dough is loaded into the oven. Baked bread is removed and set to cool. New dough is mixed. The cycle continues. Apprentices work alongside the master, handling simpler tasks, learning through observation and practice. The bakery is warm from the oven, filled with the smell of bread and the soft sounds of work. The thump of dough on the table, the scrape of the peel, the creak of the oven door. Outside, the town wakes to another day. Church bells mark the hours. Merchants open their stalls. People go about their business. And the bakery continues its quiet work, producing the bread that will sustain them all. Let's pause here and appreciate this scene. The continuity of it. The way basic human needs create daily rhythms. The way craftsmanship develops over years of patient practice. There's a stability here, a reliability. The bread will be there. It always has been. It always will be. Rest for a moment in this knowledge.
As we move into the Renaissance and beyond, we see increasing specialization in bread production. The roles of miller and baker, which had sometimes overlapped, became more distinct. Mills grew larger and more sophisticated. Some were grand structures, impressive feats of engineering. Multi-story buildings housed complex systems of gears, shafts, and multiple sets of millstones. These mills could produce large quantities of flour, serving entire regions. The millers who operated these establishments were businessmen as much as craftsmen. They negotiated with farmers for grain, They managed complex accounts. They maintained their equipment. They employed workers to handle the physical labor. The miller's house was often attached to the mill itself. The family lived with the constant sound of grinding, the constant vibration of turning machinery. Children grew up with flour dust on everything. The rhythm of the mill became the rhythm of family life. Bakers, meanwhile, focused exclusively on their craft. With reliable flour supplies from specialized mills, they could refine their techniques, experiment with recipes, develop signature products. In cities, bakeries became more numerous and specialized. Some focused on luxury breads for wealthy customers. Others produced affordable bread in quantity. Some specialized in specific types, rye bread, or enriched breads made with butter and eggs. This specialization allowed for innovation. Bakers had time to experiment with different ratios of ingredients, different fermentation times, different baking techniques. Knowledge spread through apprenticeship and through the gradual migration of bakers from city to city, each bringing their techniques and learning new ones. During this period, bread making began to incorporate a wider variety of ingredients. Though the basic process remained fundamentally unchanged, eggs began appearing more frequently in bread recipes, particularly in enriched breads. Eggs added richness, color, and helped create a tender crumb. But they also made the bread more expensive, keeping such loaves in the realm of the wealthy. Butter and milk transformed simple bread into something luxurious. These ingredients created a soft, tender texture. They added flavor. They made the bread stay fresh longer, but again, they were expensive, limiting their use. Sugar, as it became more available through colonial trade, found its way into some bread recipes. Not much, just enough to add a subtle sweetness, to feed the yeast more effectively, to help the crust brown beautifully. Spices, also from distant lands, were sometimes added to festive breads: cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom. Each brought exotic flavors to special occasion loaves. These spiced breads marked celebrations, holidays, significant life events. The techniques for mixing and kneading were also refined. Bakers learned that extended kneading developed the gluten network more fully, creating bread with better structure. They learned to judge the exact point when the dough had been kneaded enough, when it became smooth and elastic, when it could be stretched thin without tearing. Shaping techniques became more elaborate. Braided loaves appeared, their intricate patterns requiring skill and patience. Decorative scoring became an art form, with bakers developing signature patterns that marked their bread as uniquely theirs. The understanding of fermentation deepened, though the science behind it remained unknown. Bakers learned, through observation and experience, that cooler temperatures slowed fermentation, while warmer temperatures sped it up. They learned that longer, slower fermentation developed better flavor. Some bakers began maintaining multiple types of leavening, different starters with different characteristics. One might produce a milder bread, another a tangier one. These starters were valuable, carefully maintained, sometimes passed down through generations. In this period, white bread became increasingly associated with wealth and status. The preference for white bread has a long history, as we've seen, but it became more pronounced during the 17th and 18th centuries. To produce truly white flour required extensive sifting. The flour was passed through increasingly fine sieves, each removing more of the bran and germ, leaving only the white endosperm. This process was labor-intensive and wasteful. Much of the wheat kernel was removed, but the result was prized. White bread had a light texture, a mild flavor, and a soft crumb. It represented refinement, literally and figuratively. To serve white bread to guests was to demonstrate wealth and status. To eat brown bread was to mark oneself as common. Ironically, we now understand that the parts removed to make white flour, the bran and germ, contain most of the wheat's vitamins, minerals, and fiber. White bread, for all its prestige, was nutritionally inferior. But this wasn't known at the time. The preference was aesthetic and social, not nutritional. The production of white flour drove innovations in milling. Finer sieves were developed. The millstones themselves were carved with more precision. The goal was always the same: whiter flour, finer texture, higher status. Bakeries that could consistently produce good white bread prospered. Their reputation grew. Wealthy customers sought them out. The baker's skill in working with fine white flour, which behaved differently than coarser flour, requiring adjustments in water content and handling, became a mark of mastery. Yet for most people, bread remained darker, coarser, made from whatever grain was available and affordable. The peasant's loaf, the worker's bread, was still made from whole grains, or rye, or mixed grains. It was still substantial, filling, nourishing in its way. This division, white bread for the wealthy, brown bread for the poor, would persist for centuries. It reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. It shaped cultural attitudes, and it influenced the development of bread-making techniques and milling technology. But through all of this, whether white or brown, fine or coarse, enriched or plain, bread remained bread. The basic process was the same: flour, water, salt, leaven. Mixing, fermentation, shaping, baking. These fundamentals connected the finest manchet on a noble's table to the coarse loaf in a peasant's cottage. The story continues. But let's pause here. Feel the weight of history, generations upon generations, each baking their bread, each variation on the same ancient theme. There's a profound continuity in this. Something deeply human. Rest in that continuity for a moment. The Industrial Revolution transformed many aspects of life, and bread making was no exception. Yet, the transformation was gradual, uneven, and initially resisted by many traditional bakers. The first mechanical dough mixers appeared in the early 19th century. These were simple machines by today's standards. A large bowl held the dough. Arms or blades rotated through it, mimicking the motion of hand kneading. The power came initially from hand cranks, later from steam engines. For bakers accustomed to working dough by hand, these machines were both fascinating and troubling. On one hand, they reduced the physical labor of kneading. A baker could mix larger batches more quickly. On the other hand, they removed some of the tactile feedback, the intimate knowledge that came from feeling the dough develop under one's hands. Early adopters of mechanical mixers were often large commercial bakeries in cities. These establishments were producing bread at scale, supplying hundreds or thousands of loaves daily. For them, mechanical mixing was an economic necessity. They couldn't rely on hand kneading to meet demand. Smaller, traditional bakeries were slower to mechanize. The baker, who had learned their craft through apprenticeship, who judged dough by feel and experience, often preferred traditional methods. The machines were expensive, they required maintenance, they could break down, and they produced bread that, in the opinion of many traditional bakers, lacked something, some quality that came from human touch. The debate over hand mixing versus machine mixing reflected a larger tension in society. Tradition versus progress, craft versus efficiency, quality versus quantity. This tension would play out repeatedly as industrialization advanced. Roller mills appeared in the mid-19th century, revolutionizing flour production. Unlike stone mills, which ground grain between two stones, roller mills used a series of metal rollers. The grain passed between pairs of rollers, each progressively closer together, gradually reducing it to flour. Roller mills had several advantages. They were faster than stone mills. They produced more consistent flour, and crucially, they were better at separating the endosperm from the bran and germ, making it easier and cheaper to produce white flour. With roller mills, white flour became more affordable. What had once been a luxury available only to the wealthy now became accessible to the middle class. The consumption of white bread increased dramatically. The old stone mills didn't disappear overnight. In rural areas, watermills and windmills continued operating for decades. Some millers argued that stone-ground flour was superior, that the slow grinding at cooler temperatures preserved qualities that were lost in roller milling. But economics favored the roller mills. Gradually, the old mills fell silent. One of the most significant developments of the 19th century was the scientific understanding of yeast and fermentation. For thousands of years, as we've explored, bakers had worked with fermentation without understanding it. They knew that dough left to sit would rise. They knew that adding a piece of yesterday's dough would start today's dough rising. But they didn't know why. The work of Louis Pasteur in the 1,850 seconds and 1,850 860 seconds, revealed that fermentation was caused by living microorganisms. Yeast, he demonstrated, were tiny single-celled fungi. They consumed sugars and produced carbon dioxide and alcohol as byproducts. The carbon dioxide gas created the bubbles that made bread rise. This understanding transformed baking. If yeast were living organisms, they could be cultivated, isolated, and produced commercially. The first commercial yeast appeared in the late 19th century. Before commercial yeast, bakers relied on sourdough starters or liquid yeasts that they maintained themselves. These worked well, but required constant attention. They had to be fed regularly with flour and water. They could become contaminated or die. Each starter had its own characteristics, its own balance of yeasts and bacteria. Commercial yeast was different. It was consistent. It was pure, containing only specific strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the yeast species used for bread. It was convenient. You could buy it as needed, rather than maintaining a starter. Initially, commercial yeast came in the form of compressed cakes that had to be refrigerated. Later, active dry yeast appeared, granules that could be stored at room temperature and reconstituted in warm water when needed. The adoption of commercial yeast was another gradual process. Large commercial bakeries embraced it quickly. The convenience and consistency appealed to them. Small traditional bakeries were more hesitant. Many felt that sourdough produced better flavor, more complex bread. This debate continues even today. Sourdough enthusiasts argue that the diverse microbial community in a sourdough starter creates flavors and textures that commercial yeast cannot match. They point to the health benefits of the long fermentation. They celebrate the connection to tradition. Users of commercial yeast counter that it's reliable, convenient, and produces excellent bread. They note that it allows for shorter fermentation times, more predictable schedules. They argue that with good technique, commercial yeast bread can be just as delicious. As with so many aspects of bread making, there's truth in both perspectives. Different approaches serve different needs. What matters is that bread continues to be made, in whatever form, by whatever method. By the early 20th century, large factory bakeries were appearing in major cities. These were industrial operations, producing thousands of loaves daily, distributed over wide areas. Picture such a factory. It's a large building, multiple stories, filled with the hum of machinery. Grain is delivered by the ton. It's stored in massive silos. Flour is mixed in huge mechanical mixers, batches of dough weighing hundreds of pounds. The dough moves through the factory on conveyor belts. It's automatically divided into uniform portions. Machines shape these portions into loaves. The loaves move into proof boxes, large chambers with controlled temperature and humidity where they rise. After proofing, the loaves move into enormous ovens, tunnel ovens that might be 100 feet long. The bread travels slowly through these ovens on conveyors, baking as it moves. At the far end, finished loaves emerge, are cooled, sliced, and packaged. The entire process is optimized for efficiency. Every step is timed precisely. The goal is consistency. Every loaf, exactly like every other loaf. Quality control involves specifications, measurements, standardized procedures. The workers in these factories often have specialized roles. One person tends the mixers, another manages the ovens. Someone else oversees packaging. The intimate knowledge of traditional baking, the ability to judge dough by feel, to read the oven by eye, is less important here. What matters is following procedures, maintaining machinery, keeping the line moving. The bread produced in these factories is soft, uniform, and very white. It stays soft for days due to added conditioning agents. It's sliced uniformly by machine. It's wrapped in waxed paper or plastic. It's distributed widely, available in every grocery store and market. This industrialized bread made white bread available to everyone, not just the wealthy. In this sense, it was democratic. It was also affordable. Mass production drove prices down. But critics argued that something was lost. The bread was bland, lacking the character of traditionally made bread. The texture was too soft, almost spongy. The crust was thin and wan. The flavor was minimal. There was also growing concern about the nutritional content. The flour used was highly refined, stripped of bran and germ. Various additives were used to improve texture and shelf life. The bread was filling but not particularly nourishing. These concerns would lead, decades later, to regulations requiring the enrichment of white flour with vitamins and minerals, an attempt to replace at least some of what was removed in processing. But in the early 20th century, factory-made white bread was seen as progress. It was modern, scientific, efficient. It freed people from the labor of home baking. It seemed to represent the promise of technology, better living through industrial innovation. Let's rest here for a moment. We've moved from ancient stone mills to factory production lines. It's been a long journey, but through it all, the essential act remains: transforming grain into bread, sustaining life, nourishing bodies. The journey continues. By the mid-20th century, industrially produced bread dominated in many countries, particularly in the United States. White sandwich bread, soft and uniform, was ubiquitous. But not everyone was satisfied. Some people remembered or discovered traditional breads: crusty sourdoughs, hearty rye breads, rustic country loaves. They noticed the difference in flavor, in texture, in satisfaction. They wondered what had been lost in the march of progress. Small traditional bakeries still existed, particularly in Europe. In France, the boulangerie remained a neighborhood institution. In Germany, bakeries produced dozens of varieties of dark, seeded breads. In Italy, every region had its characteristic breads. These bakeries worked much as they always had, rising early, mixing dough by hand or with small mixers, shaping loaves individually, baking in deck ovens. The bread they produced was distinctive, characterful, deeply satisfying. People began to notice, to compare. They noticed that traditional bread had real crust, thick and crackling, not soft and pale. They noticed that it had flavor, complex, developed through long fermentation. They noticed that it was satisfying in a way that industrial bread wasn't. This growing awareness happened slowly at first. It was connoisseurs, food lovers, people with memories of better bread. But gradually, it spread. Articles were written, cookbooks were published. People began baking at home, trying to recreate traditional breads. What came to be called the artisan bread movement began in earnest in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. Bakers, frustrated with industrial bread, started new bakeries dedicated to traditional methods. These bakers looked to European traditions for inspiration. They learned about pain au levain, the French sourdough. They studied the long, slow fermentation that developed its characteristic tang. They experimented with different flours, different hydration levels, different baking techniques. They rejected the additives and conditioners used in industrial baking. Their ingredient lists were simple: flour, water, salt, and wild yeast. No dough conditioners, no preservatives, no added gluten. Just the basic ingredients that had been used for thousands of years. They sought out better flour, often working directly with millers. They wanted flour from specific wheat varieties. They wanted whole grain flour, stone ground when possible. They wanted flour with flavor and character, not just functionality. They returned to long fermentation. Where industrial bread might rise for an hour or two, artisan bakers let their dough ferment for 4, 6, 12 hours, sometimes even longer. This slow fermentation developed flavor, improved digestibility, and created the open, irregular crumb structure characteristic of artisan bread. They shaped their loaves by hand, each one slightly different, bearing the mark of the baker's hands. They baked in hot ovens, often stone deck ovens that mimicked old wood-fired ovens. They introduced steam into the oven at the beginning of baking, which helped create a crispy, glossy crust. The bread they produced was different from anything in the average supermarket. It had real weight, real substance. The crust was thick and crunchy, requiring effort to bite through. The crumb was chewy, with irregular holes and a tangy, complex flavor. It stayed fresh for days without packaging, actually improving in some ways as it aged. These artisan bakeries started small, Often just one baker, working alone or with a few assistants, producing a limited quantity of bread daily. They sold from the bakery itself or at farmers' markets. People sought them out, willing to pay more for better bread. Gradually, these bakeries multiplied. In cities, in towns, even in some rural areas, artisan bakeries appeared. Each had its character, its specialties, but all shared a commitment to traditional methods, quality ingredients, and handcrafted bread. The bakers in these establishments were a different breed from factory workers. They were artisans in the true sense, craftspeople dedicated to their work. Many had trained in Europe or studied under established artisan bakers. They rose at 2 or 3 a.m. to start their dough. They worked long hours in hot bakeries. They did this not for great wealth, but for the satisfaction of creating something genuine, something connected to tradition. Alongside the artisan bakery movement came a renaissance in home baking. People wanted to make their own bread, to experience the process themselves, to have that connection to an ancient craft. Home baking had never completely disappeared, but it had declined significantly with the availability of cheap commercial bread. Now it returned, but with a new focus. People weren't just making simple sandwich bread. They were attempting sourdough, attempting artisan-style breads. Books appeared, teaching home bakers these techniques. The internet provided communities where bakers could share experiences, troubleshoot problems, celebrate successes. People posted photos of their loaves, their cross-sections, their scoring patterns. Maintaining a sourdough starter became a hobby, almost a pet. Bakers gave their starters names. They fed them religiously. They worried when their starter seemed sluggish. They celebrated when it was active and vigorous. The process of making sourdough bread at home is slow. It requires planning. The starter must be fed the day before baking. The dough must be mixed and left to ferment. It must be shaped and left to proof. Finally, it can be baked. The entire process might take 24 hours or more. But this slowness is part of the appeal. In a fast-paced world, bread making offers a different rhythm. You cannot rush it. You must wait for the fermentation. Trust the process. There's a meditative quality to it. Mixing the dough, feeling it transform under your hands, shaping it, watching it slowly rise. When the bread finally comes out of the oven, the crust crackles as it cools. The smell fills the house. There's a profound satisfaction. You made this, with your hands, with time, with patience. It connects you to countless generations of bakers stretching back to those first people who mixed wild grain with water. The bread itself is rewarding. The crust shatters when you cut into it. The interior is tender, with irregular holes and a tangy flavor. Spread with butter, or dipped in olive oil, or simply eaten plain, it's deeply satisfying in a way that goes beyond mere nutrition. Home bakers often find that the process becomes important in itself, not just the end product. The weekly ritual of feeding the starter, mixing dough, shaping loaves, the way these activities structure time, create rhythms, the way they demand presence and attention. There's also community in this. Home bakers share their experiences online and with friends. They give loaves as gifts. They teach others. There's a gentle pride in saying, I made this bread myself. Let's rest here, in this image. Home kitchens, filled with the smell of bread, hands working, dough, the quiet satisfaction of craft. It's a return, in a way, to something very old, but it's also adapted to modern life, incorporating new knowledge while honoring ancient traditions. Throughout our journey, we've focused primarily on the bread traditions of Europe and the Mediterranean. But bread, in its many forms, exists in cultures around the world. Each has developed its own traditions, its own techniques, its own characteristic breads. Let's take a slow tour around the world, appreciating this diversity. We won't rush through these traditions. Instead, we'll pause and consider each one, appreciating the ingenuity and adaptation that created these varied breads. In India, bread comes in many forms. Chapati is unleavened, cooked quickly on a hot griddle. The dough is simple, whole wheat flour and water. It's rolled thin and cooked until it puffs up, creating layers. Chapati is made fresh for each meal, still warm when served. Naan is different, leavened with yeast and yogurt, creating a soft, slightly tangy flatbread. Traditionally, naan is baked in a tandoor, a clay oven heated with charcoal. The dough is slapped onto the hot interior wall of the tandoor, where it bakes quickly in the intense heat. The result is soft and slightly charred, perfect for scooping up curries and stews. In Ethiopia, there is injera, a spongy flatbread made from teff flour. Teff is a tiny grain, native to Ethiopia, with a distinctive tangy flavor. The batter for injera is fermented for several days, developing a sour taste. It's cooked on a hot griddle, creating a bread full of tiny holes. Injera serves as both plate and utensil. Food is placed on it, and pieces are torn off to scoop up the food. In the Middle East, bread is central to the meal. The word aish, in Arabic, means both bread and life. The two concepts are intimately connected. Pita bread is perhaps the most widely known Middle Eastern bread. It's a simple dough of flour, water, salt, and yeast. The magic happens in the baking. The dough is rolled into flat circles and baked in a very hot oven. The intense heat causes the water in the dough to turn to steam rapidly. This steam inflates the bread like a balloon, creating the characteristic pocket. When removed from the oven, the pita deflates slightly, leaving a hollow interior perfect for stuffing. But even without the pocket, pita is delicious. Soft, slightly chewy, perfect for dipping or wrapping around food. Lavash is different. Much thinner than pita, almost translucent. It's rolled out very thin and baked quickly, often in a traditional tandoor oven. The result is a bread that can be soft and flexible, or crispy and crackling, depending on how long it's baked. Lavash can be stored for long periods when dried, then refreshed with a sprinkle of water when needed. In Turkey, there is simit, a circular bread covered in sesame seeds, sold by street vendors. It's traditionally eaten for breakfast, perhaps with cheese and tea. The making of simit is a street spectacle. Vendors carry them stacked on poles, calling out to customers. Throughout the Middle East, the baking of bread has traditionally been a communal activity. In villages, there might be a communal oven where women bring their shaped loaves to be baked. This creates a daily gathering, a time for conversation and community. In China, steamed breads called mantu are common in northern regions. Unlike most breads we've discussed, mantu are steamed rather than baked. The dough is leavened with yeast, shaped into rounds, and placed in bamboo steamers over boiling water. The result is a soft, white, slightly sweet bread. Steamed bread has a completely different texture from baked bread. There's no crust, no caramelization. Instead, the exterior is smooth and soft. The interior is fluffy and tender. Mantu can be eaten plain, stuffed with savory or sweet fillings, or served alongside other dishes. In Japan, bread is a relatively recent addition to the cuisine, arriving with European contact. But the Japanese have made it their own, developing unique breads like shokupan, a milk bread that's incredibly soft and pillowy. The dough is enriched with milk, butter, and sometimes cream, creating a bread that's almost cake-like in its tenderness. Japanese bakers are known for their precision and attention to detail. The shaping of shokupan is meticulous. The baking is timed precisely. The result is a bread that's uniform, perfectly textured, and distinctively Japanese, despite its European origins. In Southeast Asia, many bread traditions show French colonial influence. Vietnamese banh mi, for instance, uses a baguette-style bread, but it's adapted to local tastes, lighter, airier, with a thinner crust than a French baguette. Despite this tremendous diversity, despite the different grains, different techniques, different shapes and textures, there's a fundamental similarity to all these breads. They all start with ground grain and water. They all require patience, whether in fermentation or in cooking. They all nourish. This universality of bread is profound. Across continents and millennia, humans have taken whatever grain grew in their region and found ways to make it into bread. They've adapted their techniques to their climate, their ovens to available materials, their methods to local traditions. In hot, dry climates, flatbreads predominate. They cook quickly, don't require complex ovens. In colder climates with more substantial ovens, larger loaves are common. They stay fresh longer, provide more sustained warmth while baking. But everywhere, bread is more than just food. It's community, shared, given, broken together. It's ritual, marking occasions, accompanying prayers. It's history, recipes passed down through generations. It's home, the smell of baking bread as a comfort and a welcome. As we near the end of our journey, this is what strikes us most. Not the differences in bread traditions, though those are fascinating, but the similarities, the shared human need for sustenance, the shared ingenuity in meeting that need, the shared pleasure in breaking bread together. Let's rest in this realization for a moment. The bread on your table, whatever its form, connects you to people across the world, to people throughout history, to the first baker who mixed flour and water and discovered something wonderful. Today, bread exists in all its forms simultaneously. Industrial bread still dominates in supermarkets. Artisan bakeries thrive in many communities. Home bakers maintain their starters and bake weekly. Traditional breads continue in their regions of origin. In large supermarkets, entire aisles are devoted to bread. White sandwich bread in its plastic bags, whole wheat bread, multigrain bread, breads with added seeds, with honey, with various grains and additions. All factory-made, uniformly sliced, wrapped for freshness. This bread serves its purpose. It's affordable, convenient, consistent. For many people, it's the bread they grew up with, the bread they know. It makes sandwiches for school lunches. It provides toast for breakfast. It's unremarkable, but reliable. At the same time, artisan bakeries have become established parts of many communities. No longer novelties, they're recognized sources of quality bread. People stop by on Saturday morning for fresh-baked loaves. They special order for dinner parties. They appreciate the craftsmanship, the flavor, the connection to tradition. These bakeries often expand beyond bread. They make pastries, croissants, pizzas. They serve coffee. They become gathering places, much like traditional bakeries always were. The smell of baking draws people in. The sight of flour-dusted bakers at work reassures. Home baking continues its resurgence. Social media is full of bread photos, scoring patterns, crumb structure, golden crusts. People share their successes and their failures. They encourage each other, share advice, celebrate the craft. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 sparked even more interest in home baking. With people confined to home, with uncertainties about food supplies, many turned to bread making. Flour and yeast became scarce in stores. Sourdough starters proliferated. Millions of people discovered or rediscovered the satisfaction of baking bread. This surge wasn't just about necessity. It was also about connection, about having something tangible to do with one's hands, about creating something in uncertain times. The slow process of bread making offered structure and purpose. The rising dough offered hope. A small thing, perhaps, but meaningful. Today's bread world is characterized by a fascinating tension between innovation and tradition. Some bakers work to recreate historical breads exactly as they were made centuries ago. Others use traditional techniques with modern understanding to create something new. There's growing interest in heritage grains, old wheat varieties that fell out of favor with industrialization. These grains, with names like red fife, turkey red, Sonora white, have distinctive flavors. They're often more nutritious than modern wheat varieties, but they're lower yielding, which is why they were abandoned. Now, some farmers and millers are reviving these grains. They're growing them on small scales, milling them carefully, and supplying them to interested bakers. The bread made from these heritage grains tastes different, more wheaty, more complex. It's a taste of history, of what bread was like before industrial agriculture. There's also experimentation with fermentation. Some bakers are pushing the boundaries of what fermentation can do. They're doing very long fermentations, days instead of hours. They're using specific combinations of bacteria and yeast to create particular flavor profiles. They're applying scientific understanding to an ancient process. At the same time, there's a return to even older techniques. Some bakers have built wood-fired ovens, baking bread as it was baked centuries ago. The bread from these ovens has distinctive characteristics: subtle smoke flavors, intense crust development, particular texture. Others are exploring breads made with no commercial yeast at all, only the wild yeasts present in the air and on the grain. This is a return to the most ancient form of leavened bread, before even the concept of maintaining a starter existed. Technology also plays a role in modern bread making, even artisan bread making. Bakers use digital thermometers to monitor dough temperature precisely. They use proofing boxes with exact temperature and humidity control. They share information globally, learning techniques from bakers thousands of miles away. But through all this innovation and experimentation, the fundamentals remain unchanged. Flour, water, salt, time. These are still the essentials. The rest is refinement, exploration, personal expression. What does the future hold for bread? It's impossible to say with certainty, but we can consider some possibilities. Climate change will affect grain production. Wheat grows best in temperate climates with specific water requirements. As climate patterns shift, traditional growing regions may become less suitable. Other regions may become viable. Farmers and plant breeders are working to develop wheat varieties that are more drought-resistant, more heat-tolerant. There may be increased diversity in the grains used for bread. Already, we see more breads made from alternative grains, like spelt, rye, kamut. Ancient grains like einkorn are being revived. Pseudo-cereals like quinoa and buckwheat are being incorporated. This diversity could make bread production more resilient and more interesting. Technology may change bread making in ways we can't fully predict. Perhaps three-dimensional food printing could create bread in new forms. Perhaps biotechnology could develop new types of yeast with specific properties. Perhaps automation could advance to the point where even artisan-quality bread could be produced by machines. But there's reason to believe that traditional bread making will endure. Despite all our technology, despite all our modern conveniences, people continue to bake bread by hand. They continue to value the process, the connection, the craft. There's something deeply human about making bread. It engages us physically, hands in dough, shaping, feeling. It engages us temporally, requiring patience, planning, waiting. It engages us socially, bread to share, to give, to break, together. These human elements ensure that bread making, in some form, will continue. Perhaps not everyone will bake bread. Perhaps most bread will continue to be commercially produced. But there will always be those who choose to maintain the old skills, who find meaning in the process, who value the connection to history and tradition. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps what matters isn't that everyone bakes bread, but that some do, that the knowledge persists, that the connection isn't broken. Let's rest here, near the end of our journey. We've traveled from wild grasses 10,000 years ago to modern kitchens and bakeries. We've seen bread evolve, adapt, persist. Through all the changes, through all the innovations, bread remains essentially what it always was. Grain transformed through human skill and patience into sustenance. Our journey through the history of bread is ending, but the story itself continues. Every day, somewhere, someone is grinding grain. Someone is mixing dough. Someone is shaping loaves. Someone is watching bread bake, waiting for the perfect moment to remove it from the oven. This cycle is eternal. It predates recorded history. It will likely continue far into the future. The specific techniques may change, the grains may vary, but the fundamental act remains. Think about this for a moment. Every loaf of bread ever made shares the same basic genealogy. The first person to mix ground grain with water and cook it started something that has never stopped. Every baker since has been part of that unbroken chain. When you eat bread, you're participating in this ancient tradition. You're experiencing something that people have experienced for 10,000 years. The taste may differ, the texture may vary, but the essential satisfaction, the breaking of bread, the chewing, the nourishment, this is timeless. There's a wisdom in bread making that goes beyond the craft itself. It's a wisdom about patience, about trusting in process, about the value of time. Bread cannot be rushed. You cannot make the dough ferment faster by willing it. You cannot force the oven to bake more quickly. You must wait. You must trust that the process, given time, will work. This is a profound lesson in our modern world, where speed is valued and patience is rare. Bread making teaches us to slow down, to wait, to trust that good things take time. There's also wisdom in the simplicity of bread. 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast, or starter. That's all you need. From these simple elements, through nothing but time and technique, something wonderful emerges. This teaches us about the potential in simple things, about how complexity can arise from simplicity, about how great satisfaction can come from basic elements skillfully combined. And there's wisdom in the sharing of bread. Bread is meant to be broken, divided, shared. The act of breaking bread together is one of humanity's oldest bonding rituals. It transcends language, culture, religion. It says, "I will nourish you. I will share what I have." As we end our journey, carry these lessons with you: the patience of fermentation, the simplicity of ingredients, the generosity of sharing. These are gifts that bread has to offer beyond its nourishment. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the history of bread. From ancient grasses to modern loaves, from stone mills to factory production and back to artisan craft, through centuries and across continents. But perhaps this isn't really an ending. Perhaps it's just a pause in a story that continues. Tomorrow, someone will wake early and start mixing dough. They'll shape loaves with practiced hands. They'll slide them into the oven and wait for the transformation to occur. The bread will bake, the crust will form, the smell will fill the air. And when it's done, when it's cooled just enough, it will be broken and shared. Sustenance and community, nourishment and connection. This will happen tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The story continues, as it always has, as it always will. Rest now. Let these images drift through your mind. Ancient hands grinding grain, medieval bakers tending their ovens, modern artisans shaping sourdough, all part of the same eternal story. The bread is baking, the world turns, and in this gentle rhythm, there is peace. Sleep well.